Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Leslie Marsden and I'm the Landscape Officer for the Broads Authority. The purpose of this presentation is to inform members about the recently commissioned landscape sensitivity study for renewables and associated infrastructure, and to provide members with an early sight of its findings. Andrew Tempany from Land Use Consultants will be describing the technical aspects of the study, which includes the process, the criteria that has been agreed and used for the assessment, and an outline of the findings of the study. The project board have included members from the planning team, and Alison McNabb, who is with us today, she's sat over there, and Andrea Long, both assisted in the development of the brief and provided feedback on the emerging layout and the content of the report. So, what were the drivers for the study? As you're aware, there is an increasing demand for the production of sustainable energy. This drive is one that should be supported by the authority. However, some of these technologies do have the potential to impact on the nationally valued landscape of the Broads and the characteristics which make its landscape so special. This study, which has used recognised landscape assessment techniques as part of the evaluation process, will provide a sound evidence base for officers to deal with the increasing numbers of planning applications for these new technologies. And this applies both to applications within our boundary and via neighbourhood consultations from adjacent districts. The development management policies are now in place, and the study, which will be used in conjunction with the baseline landscape character assessment, will expand on the level of information available to potential planning applicants and aid the interpretation of the relevant policies. It has also provided an opportunity to update the landscape character assessment work. Now, this work was originally completed in 2006, and this new study meant we can add a greater level of detail in relation to the perceptual qualities of the 31 local character areas. As part of the exercise, the validation exercise for the updates for the landscape character assessment, we have consulted all relevant parish councils and will incorporate their comments in detail into the published material. To date, 31 of the 90 parish councils that have been consulted have responded. Natural England has also been undertaking a major overhaul of the content of their national character area profiles. Now, we have contributed to that update, and our own character assessment work will dovetail nicely into this national profile for the Broads. And finally, the study will help to prepare us for dealing with the infrastructure requirements for massive offshore wind farms to be sited off the East of England coastline. So, what's the scope of the study? Now, Andrew's going to deal with this in more detail, but in summary, the study relates only to an assessment of the landscape sensitivity of the Broads, primarily based on the visual and perceptual characteristics of the area. It uses the updated landscape character assessment as the baseline. It doesn't take account of the nature conservation value of the area or the potential impact on the landscape fabric, such as loss of grazing marsh in photovoltaic developments. This level of detail can only be dealt with on a single application basis. It's also not a capacity study. We're not intending to set any targets for meeting renewable energy generation. So, who's going to use this study? The study is intended to provide a baseline information for the Broads Authority's own planners for both informal inquiries and formal applications. We hope the information will prove to be helpful for our neighbouring districts when they're processing applications for such developments near the Broads, and which have the potential to impact on the special qualities of our cultural landscape. To this end, all the districts have been consulted on the brief. One of them has been involved with the interview process for the consultants, and they've been kept up to date with the progress, and they will be sent a recording of this presentation for them to use at their own committees should they choose to. Some of the officers from the adjacent authorities are here today to hear this presentation. We hope also that the ultimate document will provide clear guidance to potential planning applicants, especially clarifying the criteria that they will need to consider when undertaking the assessment of the potential impacts of a particular development proposal on the Broads landscape. Now, how are we going to make this available? I intend to review the presentation aspect of the existing landscape character documentation and add the new information which his studies has provided. This will be available on the Broads Authority websites under the planning section and will be downloadable as PDF. The sensitivity study will sit as a standalone document available as a PDF on our website, but it will be linked to the landscape character assessment work. So now I'll hand over to Andrew to do the detail of the study.
Today's presentation is going to focus on what landscape sensitivity is, why it matters and why it's useful or important to the Broads Authority, and then an overview of the process that we've undertaken in developing the work. So, in terms of a definition, many definitions are used by landscape professionals, but perhaps the simplest and clearest one is this one, which we've developed for the study. And it's really the extent to which character and quality of the landscape is susceptible to change as a result of wind energy and infrastructure and solar PV. So it's really considering its vulnerability or its ability to accommodate change, essentially. In terms of why it matters and why it's useful, clearly we're dealing with a landscape of outstanding quality and special character recognised in the national designation. But in addition, the landscape of the Broads and all landscapes are sensitive in different ways to different forces for change and different renewable energy scenarios. In the case of the Broads, we also need to recognise that renewable energy schemes proposed outside the national park can have wide-ranging landscape and visual impacts on the Broads landscape. So there's a need to guide and manage change in ways that respect that special character. And also an understanding of the sensitivity of the landscape to these types of change can form a very useful evidence base, as Leslie mentioned, for planning decisions and to aid development management decisions as well. So just very quickly summarise the process. As Leslie's mentioned, we updated the existing landscape character assessment information to gather information on experiential or perceptual aspects of landscape character and things that would be particularly sensitive to certain types of renewables, so things like tranquility, for example. We also consider the potential visual issues with adjacent districts, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail shortly, and sought to understand the special qualities underpinning the national designation of the Broads. And as well, understanding the likely types of renewable energy developments that would come forward and the kind of impacts that they would give rise to. We brought these together to define a series of landscape sensitivity criteria to assess in relation to the local landscape character areas within the Broads, which we then applied and tested on site. This is then used to map and describe landscape sensitivities and most importantly to identify specific elements that are sensitive and what they're sensitive to. So in terms of the existing landscape character assessment information, the baseline is the 31 local landscape character areas that have been derived in the 2006 study. But working on site, we collected additional information in relation to tranquility, skyline character, aspects of experience that are concerned with recreation, and so on. Consideration is also given to the interrelationship of these landscapes within the Broads to other landscape character areas in districts beyond the executive area. So consideration of visual relationships or topographic and visually prominent features in terms of ridge lines and valley sides and so on. Given the unique way that the landscape's evolved, it's very useful to look at aspects of historic landscape character as well, with the Norfolk historic landscape characterisation, which we see here. And there's that certain aspects of historic landscape types will have very specific sensitivities to certain types of renewables. So in terms of very sort of small scale or intricate landscape types, for example, and how they might be perceived in relation to turbines and large footprint solar PV developments and so on. In terms of potential visual issues with adjacent districts, we used some digital modelling techniques to develop some illustrative visibility analyses, primarily for wind turbines, but we picked a number of points from certain prominent locations within and adjacent to the Broads area and mapped some theoretical zones of visibility to give an overview of the likely kind of visual impact that would potentially occur, and which informs the visual analysis undertaken as part of this study. and was also tested through our site work as well. So that's the landscape and visual character aspects of the that are fed into the analysis and development of criteria. But it's also essential to understand the special qualities of designation which are referred to in the Broads plan. So not only the words by Ted Ellis there, with the breathing space for cure of souls, but other aspects in terms of the wide open landscapes and winding waterways and the expansive skies and so on, and this very distinct sense of space, tranquility and wildness, and associated diversity of habitats, but also the very distinctive local character and vernacular in terms of historic settlements and historic buildings. We also scoped and looked at the likely types of renewable energy development that would come forward, and use this to inform a typology within our assessment to assess the sensitivity of the landscape to a range of different renewables, essentially. A range of turbine heights and sizes of groups and clusters from single turbines up to sort of very large schemes. Consideration is also given to infrastructure associated with potential offshore wind farms, so pylons, for example. And in terms of solar PV, this considered roof-mounted, but then small, say, sub-1 hectare schemes that would fit within existing fields, and then larger schemes of 1 to 5 hectares. So these illustrations give some idea of the kind of likely visual issues, particularly with solar PV at the bottom there. We get this sort of idea of kind of reflectivity and quite reflective planes, almost water-like. But when we got this information together, we defined a series of criteria for assessing the sensitivity of the landscape character areas within the Broads. And they relate mainly to the impact on special qualities and the whole sort of perception and experience of the landscape. Issues around the sense of enclosure and scale and sense of openness, and landscape and land cover pattern and the related aspects like historic landscape character. And what these sketches are intended to show, and they're supported by added explanation within the report, but they're intended to show a range from lower to higher sensitivity, essentially. So in terms of special qualities of the Broads, to consider in terms of sensitivity to turbines, for example, at the highest end there we'd have those sort of much more simple and open skylines are defined by very kind of historic vertical elements like church towers and wind pumps and so on, and then sort of gradually where there might be more of an urban fringe influence that might start to act on that. So this explains the kind of relative gradation in a way from higher to lower. And likewise in terms of enclosure and scale, where there's very sort of small scale and contained landscapes here would have a much sort of higher sensitivity to the introduction of very large scale elements such as wind turbines. Although the inverse would actually be true for solar PV, because there's a potential to visually accommodate such things. And the final ones are skylines as well, clearly a very important aspect of the character of the Broads, but again very closely interrelated to aspects of the special qualities. And another interrelated theme are views and intervisibility. Intervisibility being the kind of property of being able to see between various different character areas, both within and outside the Broads, essentially. And clearly that has a significant implication for both wind turbines and solar PV for the kind of larger scale and more expansive open marshland landscapes that characterise parts of the Broads. So once we defined these criteria, we needed a way of calibrating or defining thresholds of sensitivity. And we've developed a 5-point sensitivity scale. And this again is all set out in the report, which will be available on the web shortly. But it relates to the respective kind of vulnerabilities or the ability to accommodate change. So where landscapes have a much lower sensitivity, they have a greater ability to accommodate change without the characteristics of that landscape being adversely affected, and the inverse clearly true for high sensitivity landscapes. So sensitivity was mapped after field work for all of the 31 character areas for both wind turbines and for solar PV. And it's unsurprisingly, really, a lot of the landscapes in the Broads are at the kind of higher end of the sensitivity scale, due to the representation of special qualities and aspects of historic landscape character. Generally, where there's sort of a bit more of an influence of settlement fringe influences, so here at Thorpe Island and in certain parts of the Waveney Valley down towards Lowestoft, a slightly lower sensitivity rating. The situation is very similar in terms of overall landscape sensitivity to solar PV as well. But what is actually much more useful and interesting within the report is understanding the reasons why those character areas are sensitive and the individual elements or criteria that make that up. So I'll just talk through very, very briefly a couple of those. With reference to landscape character areas 1 and 2 in the western end of the Waveney Valley within the executive area near Bungay and Beccles. So we'll look at a couple of examples of the criteria applied in terms of sensitivity to wind turbines. So with regard to scenic and special qualities, the sense of openness in parts of these parts of the Waveney Valley and indeed the sense of tranquility render it very sensitive to larger structures such as turbines because of the disturbance they might introduce. Although we've taken account of other intrusions, so in terms of settlement edge influences, for example, which slightly reduces the sensitivity rating to a moderate high, but again still significant. And to consider skylines, a large part of these two areas is defined by very prominent ridgelines and predominantly undeveloped ridgelines and valley sides, which would have clearly have a very high sensitivity to the introduction of large-scale vertical structures, hence that rating there. And enclosure and scale, again, where there are aspects of sort of small-scale landscape character created by vegetation and landscape structure, this again increases sensitivity. So for each of the character areas, we have a discussion on the kind of overall sensitivity of the landscape to wind turbines in this case, and this draws out the kind of important findings from the criteria, and this is the summary message that will be used by planning officers and development and management officers to understand what's important as applications come forward and so on. It's really very much about representation of special qualities in this case, and surviving historic landscape features, and indeed issues of visual prominence in relation to the surrounding topography. The report also considers the sort of varying sensitivities of the different size turbines within the typology that we've set out. So there's a very slightly lower sensitivity in this case for kind of domestic scale turbines of below 20 metres in height, mainly because they would relate more closely potentially to existing landscape elements. As Leslie's mentioned, there's also been consideration to the adjacent character areas outside the Broads, so in this case in South Norfolk and Waveney districts, and we've identified the sensitive or prominent features in relation to the Broads Authority within those, and they've been brought out in a little summary description as well. Exactly the same process has been repeated for the solar PV typologies for all the areas. I just sort of very briefly show some examples of these because the interpretation of criteria is obviously going to be slightly different for those given the different nature of the technology and particular issues around openness and enclosure, for example. So again, considering landscape character areas 1 and 2, there's a sort of mix in terms of medium scale field patterns in the western part of the area, but then contrasting with sort of smaller scale and more intact landscape in other sort of large parts of it, so which provides a degree of visual containment and ability to accommodate that, which results in a moderate sensitivity in those terms. Although it's recognised that areas of small-scale landscape would be more vulnerable due to potential land take associated with such schemes. And situation with landscape and land cover, again, it's that small-scale pattern indicates the higher sensitivity and elevates that sensitivity essentially. So key messages in conclusion from this project, which helps meet some of the strategic objectives of the Broads plan. The study identifies that landscape sensitivity to the renewable typologies identified is consistently fairly high in terms of character and special qualities. There are no landscape character areas within the Broads that score low or moderate low in terms of sensitivity, for example. Although high sensitivity areas tend to be those with the most intact representation of special qualities or historic landscape patterns. However, as we've seen from some of those examples, you need to consider that there are variations in sensitivity within character areas, and the text in the report draws that out and draws out the kind of important elements for officers to consider. So thank you for your time. That concludes the presentation.